Thanks, Purnima. So, welcome everyone to this course. Let me share my screen so that I can tell you what we are doing today, and my co-faculty who's all here with me. And okay, so I think I'll have to minimize this, otherwise. Okay, so I think this is how it is. Our course is. I can hear somebody's echo coming from somebody's system. Can we mute everybody else, please? Is it from an adjoining hall? At least on virtual field, we should be having adjoining halls. Okay, so the whole idea of this course was that refractive surgery is still the domain of a few, and I feel that refractive surgery can easily become one of the most after cataract surgery, it can become one of the most commonly performed surgeries if every cataract surgeon could start thinking and working like a refractive surgeon, even if he doesn't own a refractive laser machine. So that was the whole idea, how you can take your first steps if you're doing good cataract surgery and you want to start doing laser correction surgery or refractive surgery of some kind, non-laser based, you could be able to do that. So we have a very, very stellar faculty with us here, and we are hoping to have good discussions. With me today are Dr. Chitra Ramamurthy, who's one of our most prolific speakers, the chairman of the Academic and Research Committee of AIOS, and a dear friend, and Dr. Priya Desai, who's again a dynamic refractive and cornea surgeon from Vadodara. And we have Dr. Parul Sharma, who's director of Max Group of Hospitals in Delhi. She's a prolific eye surgeon, does glaucoma, cataract, and refractive. I have dear friend Rishi Swaroop, who's again a brilliant cornea surgeon, does a lot of refractive and cataract surgery as well, and will be able to add a lot of value to this course. I have with me our young doctor, dynamic young surgeon, Dr. Rohan Mehra, who is again trained at Narayan Nethralaya and is again a good cataract and refractive surgeon who will be chipping with his bit. He's representing the young brigade. And we have Dr. Saurabh Chaudhary from the Eye Care Hospital in Noida, again a very dear friend, but also one of the top trainers in the country for cataract surgery and a good refractive surgeon as well. So I think with that introduction, I will start off with my short first talk, if everybody is okay with it. Should I go ahead, please? Okay, so starting to think like a refractive surgeon. So why should you start to think like a refractive surgeon? Because unless you start thinking like one, you will not become one. So if you do good cataract surgery or you're a good anterior segment surgeon, if you have to probably start thinking like a refractive surgeon. So any surgery which aims to minimize dependence on glasses could qualify as a refractive surgery, and most people now aspire to be free of the dependence on glasses. The last 10-15 years I've seen a huge shift in the way people think. Glasses were absolutely fine 10-15 years back. Today most people would naturally feel that they should not be wearing glasses if they they would expect every surgery to give you a result which is giving you some kind of freedom from glasses. So it could be following cataract surgery with contact lens intolerance, high refractive errors, presbyopes, sports persons, occupational requirements. They are appearing for the forces, medicals, airline industries, so many other places, cosmetic reasons. And then of course, sometimes it's peer pressure for the youngsters. And is it necessary to buy a LASIK machine to be a refractive surgeon? So absolutely a big no. You don't have to buy a LASIK machine if you want to be a refractive surgeon. And who is best qualified to be a refractive surgeon? So, I'm sorry. Every cataract surgeon for that matter. And why? Because he's already a skilled surgeon, he or she. He already has a decent OPD and volume and a surgery load, understands the need for emmetropia, because today cataract surgery is itself become a refractive surgery, and already has most equipments which are required to become a refractive surgeon. And it allows an added revenue stream, which does not hurt anyone, especially in the COVID times. So it's a natural process of, if you would like to switch to refractive surgery as well and add it to your armamentarium. There is continuing to be disturbance from the background, so I'll request the backend team to please look into it. Why we are getting noises from the background? Somebody has to mute himself or herself from your backend team. So what do we need to start? Just a change in our mindset. Refractive surgery is not the domain of a select few. Everybody can do it easily, and the quest for emmetropia and everything we do is very gratifying for both the surgeon and the patient, and it's also financially rewarding. So what to do first? Raise the bar for your cataract surgery outcomes. So start aiming for those 90% plus 6x6 patients post-op. All that goes into becoming a good cataract surgeon, refractive cataract surgeon, which would require perfection in biometry, maybe investing in an optical biometer if you still haven't done that, because that will come really handy in also doing refractive surgery. and start getting your plus minus halves in the 90% plus. And attention to astigmatism. So Dr. Chitra is going to tell us about why it is so important to tackle astigmatism if you want to be a good cataract surgeon and a good refractive surgeon. Do toric calculation even for the smallest astigmatism. In fact, I do toric calculation for all my patients. And Indian torics are very, very reasonable and have good results too. So you don't have to spend a lot of money on high cost torics. And happy emmetropic patients will also refer a few more patients, so it'll grow your practice. And now there's a large choice of presbyopia correcting IOLs. So Dr. Parul is going to talk to us about presbyopia correcting IOLs. So this has become an integral part of doing good refractive cataract surgery because it addresses the need for the near vision also. And there's a whole range of IOLs available now for helping us. And how to start? Stop demotivating patients for refractive surgery. That's typically what we do when we don't own a LASIK machine. So I think that is counterproductive because it's pushing away a huge chunk of your patients who will never come back to you again. In-house branding and on letterheads, you can start talking about refractive surgery. You can acquaint staff and hold sessions to tell them about your plans to add refractive surgery to your practice because they will always take part in that. Patient education brochures, leaflets, and watch out for patients and their attendants who may be wearing thick glasses or seeking spectacles correction. And you can casually mention the possibility of specs removal in the future to all those patients who come to you wearing glasses or who have attendants using glasses. And you can also mention the fact that refractive surgery has come a long way in the 25 years, and there are very good surgical various options other than LASIK as well, which are possible. And you can also use this opportunity to build a patient base for future refractive surgery. So you may want to buy a machine in a year or two. So you will add up patients, who may be motivated for surgery when you actually start doing it. And it's good to have patients with a stable correction for 2 to 3 years. Ideal age would be 20 to 21 years or more today. Always do good refractions. Make it a practice to record the refractions and put it on an EMR, because if you have follow-ups for 2-3 years for patients, that always helps. And if you can measure the corneal thickness and topography, a peripheral retina exam. And once the patient is convinced, what now? I think we'll go on to the next talk right after this. You can do all these things to convince the patient that he'll do better. So I think, Chitra ma'am, can we go ahead to the next talk? Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah. Okay. So Priya, I think you take over from here and tell us about how you will work up a patient once the patient is now thinking in the lines of doing a refractive surgery.
Why should Priya's talking or I'm talking?
Oh. Ma'am, I think it's Priya first, and then who's after Priya? After Priya is again me, and then it's you. So because I have to speak on ICLs and then it's you. So you are going by the order.
On astigmatism, no? I have to talk on that.
So I think, okay, what we'll do is we'll let Priya talk first, then you talk, and then I'll come back after you. Okay. Because this is a natural next talk for how to preoperatively work up patients for potential refractive surgery. So it's in continuation. I think the person who made that creative made a mistake in switching the orders, but but in the order on the course on the AIS website, it was in the correct order there. That's okay, ma'am.
Ma'am, do you need to attend? Gaurav, do you want me to continue, or if
yes, please go ahead. Yeah. Okay. No, you go ahead. Yeah. After this, Dr. Chitra can be ready for the astigmatism part.
Okay, so thank you, Dr. Gaurav. I'm going to be taking it up from where Dr. Gaurav has ended on working up and counseling a refractive surgery candidate. And see, we work like a computer. It's always an input, process, and output. Input is starting to think like a refractive surgeon, which Dr. Gaurav has very beautifully covered. The process, once you start thinking like one, is the workup and the counseling of the patient, and the result is the result of the surgery itself. So what options of treatment do you have as a cataract surgeon? LASIK, PRK, phakic-IOL, and refractive lens exchange. In fact, a cataract surgeon has that added advantage of being used to working in the anterior chamber. So there's no learning curve or learning process for a refractive lens exchange or a phakic-IOL. So what are the key points or important points which you should keep in mind before you actually start workup for a patient? One, a patient with unreasonable high expectations are not good candidates. Two, a good candidate is one who understands that refractive surgery is not risk-free, follows instructions, and is willing to wear glasses in case of residual error. Three, a good surgeon is one who does not give unreal promises, tells the patient the reasonable expected visual acuity, visual function, and the issue of enhancement. Choice of refractive procedure depends a lot on the profession of the patient expectation. 1 minute, just give a minute. Okay. 1 second. Sorry about that. So I'll go back to the slide. Am I audible?
Yes, Priya, you're.
Yeah, okay. Sorry about that. So the most important things are the history and the examination. In history, we need to ask quite a bit about the general history, whether the patient is a diabetic, a hypertensive, whether they're pregnant or nursing. Family history is very important. Always ask about the siblings if they're taking any treatment for keratoconus or if they've undergone a CXL, if there's anybody in the family who's got a glaucoma, if the patient is a steroid responder. Ocular history, asking about the refractive error, use of contact lens, or whether they've taken treatment for dry eye. And refractive error, of course, the things that we need to ask are the anisometropia, the fluctuations, the onset of refractive error. So always have a segment for history before you start examining your patient. Now, examination is usually divided into routine and refractive. Routine is our anterior segment examination where we check the visual acuity. One important point which I would always like to tell you that if you want to get into doing a refractive surgery, learn to do the refractions yourself rather than being dependent on someone else's refraction. External examination, look for ptosis, look for proptosis, look for squint, look for any lid malformations. Do a very good slit lamp examination, evert the lid, look for papillae, look for allergy. Otherwise, these are the patients who are going to ask you a lot of questions after refractive surgery. Look at the ocular surface, the tear film. Look at the cornea for its clarity, whether there are any scars or any history of trauma where a patient has got a healed keratitis or any scar or mark on the cornea. Look at the anterior chamber, the iris. The pupil size is very important, which I'm going to discuss in the consecutive slides. And in case if you're thinking in terms of doing a refractive lens exchange or a phakic IOL, the clarity of lens is very important. Also check the intraocular pressure. Fundus examination is very important. Please do check for the periphery and confirm if there are no lattices and holes. And in case if you do think that you're seeing anything in the periphery, do a retinal laser first. Don't be in a rush to do a LASIK. Refractive corneal imaging. It's corneal imaging. A cataract surgeon might not necessarily have a pentacam or an access to a Scheimpflug, but it's okay. You can even do a topography, see the anterior sagittal and the tangential maps. If you have access to a pentacam, then you can see both the entire anterior and the posterior corneal surface. You can also have access to knowing the pachymetry. And usually the safe limit is between 40 to 47 diopters of a keratometry for you to post a patient for LASIK surgery. Do the pachymetry, you can do an ultrasound, you can do an OCT based, depending on whatever machines you have. You don't necessarily have to indulge into doing very hi-fi tests in case if you don't have access to those machines. And normally it is safe to do a LASIK for somebody who's got a pachymetry more than 500 microns. If not, then you can probably go ahead and do your other options. Other parameters, pupil diameter is very important because you need to plan of how much you want to keep your treatment zone in order to avoid postoperative complications like glare and photophobia. Higher order abrasions is a talk on its own, so I'm not going to go much into detail, but white to white diameter, anterior chamber depth, very important if you're planning a phakic IOL, and dry eye. Dry eye is basically like an undercover disease that dry eye is not evaluated before LASIK surgery, and then eventually post LASIK, your patient is 6x6 and is an unhappy patient because of dry eye. So this is basically one format that I use in my hospital, which is very useful for me. So, any person who's doing a cataract surgery who wants to gradually shift into doing refractive can have a simple chart like this, that you need to fill in the chart, write everything, and then eventually you can read through and decide, okay, that I think this is probably the best option of treatment for this particular patient. So carry home message, if you spend more time in pre-operative evaluation, you will spend less time in managing the patient post-operatively. One, counsel and explain the procedure to the patient in detail. Don't think that my patient might just end up saying no. It's okay. Choose the refractive procedure wisely, keeping the workup parameters 1 and the type of patient 2 in mind. And most important is learn to say no. You don't necessarily have to do a refractive procedure for every patient who's willing. Safety is always priority. Thank you.
Thank you for sticking to your time, Priya. That was remarkable, and you managed to cover everything so nicely. So I think that set the pace for the program, and I'll request all our speakers to be as crisp as how Priya was, and I'll invite Dr. Chitra to tell us how we can go after astigmatism and how we can treat astigmatism without investing into big devices, which can be very expensive for small practices. So ma'am is going to speak to us. She's sharing this. Yes, perfect, ma'am.
Am I heard?
Yes, ma'am. Very much. Loud and clear.
Okay. So my due is to talk on astigmatism, and we all need to understand that the way we stand today, patient wants an ultimate vision restoration, and correcting astigmatism is actually gives great visual impact to the patient without the trade-offs which come with a multifocal IO. So I'm going to run you through the different pearls. The first important thing which we need to look at is that when we counsel our patients, we first need to do a biometry to know whether the patient has any amount of astigmatism, rather than launching off into seeing the cataract and talking about all the premium IOLs which you have. Because if there is a toricity there, then it makes sense to decide whether you're going to place an eye multifocal, or the patient can afford a multifocal and a toric. So biometry before a counseling is absolutely mandated. Why is it not moving? So sorry. Going further, we need to also know whether it's a regular corneal astigmatism and whether the patient has a healthy corneal surface, ocular surface. That's important. The second thing which we need to do is to verify the raw data. Now here, if you look carefully, the patient has 2 diopter plus astigmatism in the left eye, whereas 0.5 in the right eye. Assuming that it is asymmetric, we should first look whether your biometry is right, whether the dry eye status is right. And believe me, this patient had severe dry eyes, and after lubricating and after taking care, when we repeated the biometry, what we learned was that the astigmatism was same in the both eyes. So that's one more message for you. The choice of the formulae, we have done a study, and many of you would have known that the 3rd generation formulas work fine in normal eyes to an extent. But if you have access to the best of the formulae, you get more than 90% of your patients within plus minus 0.5, and you want to be premium for all your patients. So there are n number of data which have to be incorporated for the Barrett variables, which have to be incorporated, which makes your results so much better. You need to know your toric calculator. Like whether it has the Barrett algorithm incorporated in it, whether this particular toric IOL calculator has a mathematical way of calculating the posterior corneal astigmatism. If you have a Barrett algorithm incorporated as in the Alcon, then it takes care of your toricity ratio, the keratometric index, the centroid values. So different IOL toric calculators today are most promising. And if you do not have access to it, you have your immersion biometry, you could still feed in the data in the Barrett toric calculation online. You need to just feed in the IOL constant data because of the acoustic constant, which would be different, but still you would be able to get the best of the details. As I was going to show you, that the keratometry in this particular case has been done on the immersion, and you feed in all these data. Remember to add that toric IOL constant in it, and it will give you all the data, how to position a lens and what is the least residual astigmatism. Now looking at the next step. Now, if it is a with the rule astigmatism, you could probably go beyond 1.5 and then plant a toric IOL. But if it is an against the rule, we need to know that the posterior cornea is going to add more to it. So you would actually become sensitive to start using correcting with toric IOL, even from 0.8 or less. So it actually the toric calculator would tell you whether you would implant an IOL in this particular astigmatism or would you not go ahead with it. Then this was a particular case of a trifocal which was promised to the patient. The patient did have some amount of astigmatism, and the end result was that the patient had a small amount of residual refractive error. This was an education that no, I could have done better for this patient. The patient was also cognizant. He was told about the astigmatism earlier, but he wanted even greater accuracy, and thus a panoptic torics was planned in the left eye with LLVC in the right eye. And finally, the patient did optimally well. So what we understand from this is that the multifocal IOL, it is very sensitive to even small amount of toricity. And if that is addressed, the patients are most optimally happy. So you need to lower your threshold for using toric IOLs with a multifocal. Now, this is another case wherein, again, a trifocal was planned, but the amount of astigmatism, as you can see, is plus 0.67 and plus 0.55. So you need to think of another angle of approach. So what do? If you have access to a femtocataract platform, you could place arcuate incisions as what was planned here. And that took care of the correction of the astigmatism, and lo and behold, the patient was doing well. So we need to be, when you talk of toric IOLs, you need to try your best to ensure that you look into all of these pearls which are so critical. Now, supposing you have a high amount of astigmatism, a keratoconus eye with which underwent a DALC surgery, You need to wait till all the sutures are removed and look at the amount of astigmatism. About 6 diopter of astigmatism is there. Of course, the patient deserves some amount of quality of vision to be brought in. So you would go ahead and plan placing a toric IOL. Of course, you would have to do a customized IOL. You need to look into all the data, whether all are fit or right. Then look into the Barrett TK toric, and then it would tell you what should be done. And then you have a patient with just -1 cylinder, which is fine because the patient has been struggling throughout his life. He would really optimize his quality of vision. Then comes Pearl 8, nailing the target axis. See now how you could do it. You could do it on a slit lamp, marking the 3 o'clock, 9 o'clock, and then the slit beam goes right to the center of the pupil, or you could use the ASICO bubble marker. But when you use the ASICO bubble marker, even if you position it up, you could be a little 10 degree off or low. So you need to optimize on that. You need to ensure that it's just a dot mark with a needle. It is the marking area is dry. You don't use too much of ink. I'm not showing all that. And when it comes to doing the surgery, you would do all the steps of the surgery optimally. But before you position it in the final locking position, you remove the viscoelastic in front and behind the IOL, push the IOL against the posterior capsule, and then you would go ahead and lock it into final position and then get out of the case. Pearl 9 is the last one. Is if it is off axis on the slit lamp itself, you know that how much it is misaligned from where it should be. You could feed it into the astigmaticsfix.com, and then it would tell you how off you are. Like here, the patient was at 170, whereas it should have been at 85. So then what now you need to know is the spherical equivalent has to be 0. If the spherical equivalent is 0, you could rotate the lens. And if it is not 0, that means there's an IOL issue there. Either you place a piggyback lens, or you remove the IOL, or you do a bioptics for the residual refractive error. But if it is a spherical equivalent is 0, then you could go ahead and rotate these lenses and they do well. So how long would you wait before you go to realign? You could wait for at least a week or two. No harm in that. The capsule contracts a little. It would stay or be more stable for the IOL placement. Then you could go ahead and rotate. So we need to look at all these parameters: patient selection, IOL power calculator, axis aligning post-operatively. And believe me, if you follow all these pearls, you would be on dot in every single case of your toric IOL implant or your astigmatism management. Thank you.
Fantastic, ma'am. And you've squeezed in so much into such a short time and managed to finish almost in time. Thank you so much. Now we'll have a quick discussion, and we have our faculty here as well. And I wanted to understand, Rohan is there as well. Now I can see that for every surgeon who is not doing toric IOLs yet, what are the first steps? Parul, would you like to say that if somebody wants to start doing toric IOLs, what should they, be looking at as cataract surgeons? Why is it that some people are just not able to start their toric IOL practice? And, today I would look at every patient as being potentially a toric patient, even with the small, because the satisfaction level goes up tremendously.
Yeah. So usually, Gaurav, it's just a mental block, and sometimes it's a mental block, or sometimes it's just being lazy and comfortable with your practice. So one is you did a very important talk on how and when we should move forward. I think to start a toric practice, we don't need any fancy gadgets. Just anybody sitting in their routine practices has to get their all kerato and topo instruments together. I feel that to get the toric correct, first thing is to get out of the mindset of one equipment. So you can even look at your manual, your auto, your topo to get your axis and power correct. Once you have that in place, once you have your basic instruments of how to mark the axis, how to have your marker on the slit lamp, etc., these are the basic two fundamental things of getting the axis on your patient correct and on your measure, while planning it, pre-planning, and while executing it. So I think it's very easy to start with just these two basic. I think that would be the first step to graduate and start doing it in all patients. Look at anything above 1 and start.
Absolutely. Priya, there are a lot of people who have the fear of, going wrong with torics. So how forgiving are torics, and like with basic instrumentation, can you still get good results? And which are those cases where, you can get good results with torics if you don't have fancy optical biometers and stuff?
I think it's just about communication. I think more than anything else, it's very important for the surgeon to first be convinced whether they want to take that milestone up, and then it's the patient basically. You can figure out once you talk to a patient of how the patient's expectations are going to be, or probably to start with, your patient selection I think is one of the most important things. Even with your basic instruments, choose the right patient, because if you in your initial 1 or 2 cases choose the wrong patients, then I guess probably you'll be discouraged to, doing more torics. I think choosing the right patient is very important.
I agree. Rohan, would you like to add anything to that?
Yeah, I think you spoke about the fear. So that's where I think as a youngster, this would come in, that what if I promise a patient that, well, I'll make you spectacle free, and then later it does not turn out that way, even if it's a residual of a 0.75 that's left behind. So I think that is a hindrance. That's the first step that prevents people from taking it, that what if I'm not able to deliver what I have promised to the patient? Because in monofocal, you're anyways you're telling the patient that, well, you will be needing glasses. If you see on your K readings that, there is a certain degree of astigmatism, then during counseling only you do tell the patient that this astigmatism is going to stay. So the patient is comfortable. The patient knows that, this spectacle is going to be there. But once you've promised that, I'm going to get you rid of these glasses, and if you are not able to deliver on it, I think that's the first block. As ma'am said, absolutely right. If you get your first 4 to 5 cases right, I think that block goes away, and then it becomes a breeze.
Thanks. Chitra ma'am, you have to give us the final pearls. For somebody who doesn't have fancy biometers and fancy devices for keratometry and wants to integrate torics into their practice, what are your quick suggestions?
Don't have an optical biometer, you could use an immersion, as I said, and do all your measurements properly, and then feed in that IOL constant, which is there on those boxes, and then go on to the Barrett Toric online and do the calculation.
No, I meant about torics only, like keratometries. So if they don't have fancy devices for doing their keratometries, right, like they don't have a topographer, they just probably have a manual keratometer and just an auto keratometer, and so what would you suggest for those people?
No, they could use an immersion biometer.
That's for the axial length, but that's for the axial length. So for the keratometry, because people are reluctant to go into this because they are not sure about their keratometries. So I thought,
manual keratometry also you could use and get your access, and you need to just calibrate it optimally. Believe me, even if you have not corrected the whole of astigmatism, if you have debulked significant amount of astigmatism, then also these patients are very happy. Absolutely. Sometimes you have a patient with a little residual error, you wonder whether you have to rotate, but the patient looks so happy, you don't want to open the whole Pandora's box and say I have to correct it. So the happiness of the patient is what matters. It's not that 6.6 or 6.9 vision.
Absolutely. So there are 2 pearls which I wanted to add to this. I never tell patients that you'll be free of glasses. Whatever I do with any kind of toric IOL or even with refractive cataract surgery, I don't tell them that you're going to be totally free of glasses. I always tell them this is going to minimize your dependence on glasses, and you will probably need glasses. Even with my multifocals or trifocals, I tell them that you may have to use for fine print. You may still need some glasses, and for distance if you want to see your TV small lines perfectly. But 90% of your work you'll do without glasses. So that kind of sets the expectations, right? And similarly with torics, I never tell them that I'll make you free of astigmatism. I tell them our aim is to bring down your astigmatism below 1, because that leaves you room. Suppose you're left with a 0.25 or a 0.5, nobody's going to crib, because they'll come to you with the auto ref slip showing you that why do I have this 0.5 cylinder even after you've done my toric IOL. So I always tell them that eyes tolerate toric IOLs very well when the cylinders are less than 1. So you can, if I bring your astigmatism down to below 1 or 0.75, you're going to be right. So I think these are the few things, and welcome Rishi, you're looking good too. Yeah, I'll quickly go on to my next talk, and then I think it's going to be Rishi who's speaking on biometry and biometry pearls, right? For getting happy patients and refractive cataract surgery. So I'm talking on ICLs because after this I have to go for 10 minutes to Harshul's course. So how to integrate phakic lenses into your practice. Okay, so I'll try to, this could be a 1-hour talk, it could be a 2-hour talk, but I'll try to condense it into these 5-6 minutes that I have. So I'm not going to go into the details of how to do this surgery, but how to think that you want to do this, how to add this potentially to a cataract surgeon's practice. So who is a candidate? I think anyone whose age is over 21 years and less. So why should you be adding phakic lenses to your practice? Because if you don't have a LASIK machine and you don't have access to one, and you still want to do some kind of refractive surgery beyond being a refractive cataract surgeon, this is the natural next step. So age over 21 years and less than 45, a stable refraction as for any other refractive surgery. And today with with phakic lenses available from all kinds, you have all refractive errors which can be corrected, even from the smallest to the biggest. Usually they cut off at about 18 to 20 diopters of myopia. And this is the range which is available with star ICL going from +10 to -20 approximately. IPCLs can be customized for much higher powers. And believe me, the Indian lenses are pretty good. There are now several companies which are making them, and I have been using all of them. They're also doing quite well. So if your patient cannot afford a very expensive star ICL, although they still have the longest follow-ups and the most best kind of predictability, but you could have phakic lenses sizes, the sizes are available as well. I won't go into the details. So when you start thinking of putting a patient, if you don't have an excimer and you want to put a phakic lens for a patient, you would be looking at good refraction, a good pachymetry, AC depth, PRS, peripheral retina screening, and a good gonioscopy with a wide to wide. Now, an AC depth of 3 millimeters, suppose from the endothelium. Now, this is the important thing. It has to be from the endothelium. So if you are measuring on an A scan, you would have to subtract the pachymetry from that, and that would give you the anterior chamber depth without the corneal thickness, and that should be ideally 3. If you have a compromised thickness or depth of the chamber, a 2.9 or at the most a 2.8. Now, for experienced surgeons who have other parameters are all good, you would have to look at 2.8 as the final cutoff. And then, of course, angles should be open. A gonioscopy has now become standard procedure for all patients undergoing a phakic lens, and no previous ophthalmic surgery, especially a corneal refractive surgery, and other ocular pathologies like keratoconus, where you could use it, but only as a special case where for a stable keratoconus, well corrected with glasses, you would avoid eyes with glaucoma, Fuchs dystrophy, other corneal pathologies, endothelial pathologies. Contraindications, we just spoke about a few. Inflammatory disease, glaucoma are probably the ones which are most important, and then a shallow chamber, so that these things would be absolutely a no-no. One-eyed patients, you should be very careful. And sometimes you have patients like these with high myopia who might have zonal abnormalities, and they may have lens subluxations and unstable refractions. There are off-label indications following refractive surgery. It can be done as a top-up procedure for enhancement. It can be done after corneal procedures in keratoconus. Very rarely, some people have published on children for anisometropia. And yes, today people are using these for pseudophakia as piggyback lenses as well. So I think we just discussed about the preoperative assessment and indications. For the first 20 cases, it's best to take ideal cases. So ideal cases would be these which we just spoke about. And once you are looking at the anterior chamber depth, let's just not look at the number which comes out of the A scan. It would be good if you have 2 devices to do it, preferably an optical biometer would be ideal. And then it's not just the central thickness, which is measured in the center. You should be looking at the profile, because sometimes as the chamber goes to the periphery, the AC depth may vary and may be thinner than otherwise. And here I wanted to show you with this printout that it may show you an AC depth of 3.06 on the A scan. Now, this is not the AC depth, which is from the endothelium, it's from the epithelium, and you would have to subtract the corneal thickness from here. On optical biometers, it is available seamlessly because this is from the Lenstar. So investing in an optical biometer for a good cataract surgeon would be invaluable, because it allows you to get all these measurements, including the wide to wide. And these wide to wides, which are automated, are not very reliable for ICL calculation, but you can manually check them on almost all devices, including the Lenstar and the Pentacam. They are much more reliable when you do a manual check on them with the calipers. So on the Lenstar printout, you will have an AD, which is the internal AC depth from the endothelium, and you will have an ACD, which includes the corneal thickness. So you can see 2.43 and 2.97 because it's adding on the corneal thickness there. And of course, when you start doing wide to wide measurements, nothing better than doing it with calipers and digital calipers. And I'd like to do that on the slit lamp, and the horizontal wide to wide is the one which you're looking out for. And this usually coincides for me with my Pentacam. And with the Pentacam, there is a horizontal wide to wide which can be easily measured on the holiday report and also on the iris image. So if you have Pentacam, you can do that. If you visit some place which has a Pentacam, it's very easy. And when you have 2 or 3 devices, kind of correlating and giving you those readings as matching, that becomes ideal. So we already discussed about the angles that they should be open. Wide to wide can be done on so many devices. So many people have autorefs, which also allow you to measure wide to wide. And the OpScan is another good device where they have kind of tried to, manually you have to measure it, not with the automated reading. The Pentacam, as I already told you, the Lenstar. And why this is important is because the ICL vault is the key to a good surgery, a successful surgery. So if you don't have a vault which is somewhere between 250 to 700 microns, you will have problems. A very low vault can be a problem. A very high vault can cause glaucoma and other issues. So you have to avoid those. That is why it is so important to have the right preoperative measurements. Now, This is a small video on how it shows that the pentacam can be used, and on the iris image you can get a manual measurement from, say, here. You can drag it to here, and this gives you the thickness, the white to white. And you can also check this on another scan. I think over here, this is the horizontal white to white on this Holiday report, which is 11.5, and then the eCare report has it as well. So anyway, you have many lenses available. You can calculate them. I won't show you this because it's beyond the scope of this talk. So the take-home message, I think adding phakic lenses to a cataract surgeon's practice is the natural next step. It helps transition to refractive surgery without big investments, and sitting in your clinic, you can easily start offering phakic lenses. They are available for small powers to big powers now. I often do ICL for patients with -2 or 3 with thin corneas, suspect corneas, and it works really well. Satisfactions are great. And a future edition of laser refractive surgery becomes much easier. And a mindset for refractive surgery and attention to detail is all that is required, and that would take you through. And I think with that, I'll stop. And I think we'll have a discussion after Rishi's talk, maybe. And then after Rishi is Parul, and then Rohan, and then we have another talk by Dr. Chitra on clear lens extraction. So Rishi, you want to start? I'll have to take leave for 10 minutes and come back. In the meantime, I'll request Dr. Chitra ma'am to please, kind of take the discussion after Rishi's talk. I should be back by then.
After Rishi's talk, whose talk is that? Parul's talk.
After Rishi's Parul, she's speaking on presbyopia correction options. So Rishi is speaking on biometry pearls.
Thank you, Gaurav. I hope my slides visible, Dr. Chitra.
Yes.
So actually this was Saurabh's talk, but he could not be here, so I'm speaking on his behalf. IOL calculations have been going on for a while now. Earlier, we used to just kind of arbitrarily add a power of 19 diopters to the pre-cataract refraction. Otherwise, people would use a standard powered lens. Then early 90s is when the formulas came into being. And they were pretty good. Regression formulas were giving about plus or minus 1 diopter. And that was a pretty good target for that time. And then the first generation formula was the SRK formula, which all of us have learnt about in our postgraduate books, but don't use anymore. This was basically a regression formula as follows, and it has worked very well for average eyes. But the problem was the moment you went beyond average, which is beyond the range of 20 to 25 millimeters axial length, you used to get into problems and there were errors. So the second generation formula SRK2 came, which did a modification for these extremes of axial length essentially. And that also worked pretty well until you had the third generation of formula that came along, which were the SRKT of a Q and Holiday 1. These gave further refinements to improve accuracy, and especially for the longer eyes, SRKT and Holiday 1 was very good. And for shorter eyes, Hoffa Q was very good. And I think for almost 10-15 years, this was the gold standard for most of us. The last decade or so, the fourth generation formula and fifth generation formula have really taken over. And that started with the Holiday 2 and the Haigis formula. Holiday 2 is basically named after Jack Holiday. He's an ophthalmologist, but he's also a physicist. And he's done some great innovative work, the benefits of which all of us are reaping today. Basically, it needs additional measurements other than the standard keratometry and axial length. They were taking white to white, anterior chamber depth, lens thickness, patient data, etc. And that was all fed into the software, and it would give you an output of a result. Simultaneously, Haigis, Wolfgang Haigis came up with the Haigis formula for the IOL master, which was this complicated equation below, which used multivariate regression analysis. So the A constant was actually A0, A1, A2, which then kind of came together and gave you a good result. The fifth generation was the Olsen and the Barrett Universal 2. This really stepped up the kind of baseline and gave very, very accurate results. And I think even till today, I think most of us are now using the Barrett Universal 2 as the gold standard. And thankfully, Professor Barrett has made it free, and it's available online on the apacrs.org website. It's a great resource, which all of us should use if, in case you don't have access to these expensive biometers. But what has really taken everything to the next level is the involvement of artificial intelligence. And Professor Warren Hill has come out with the Hill RBF formula, And then Uday Devgan and group have come out with the LADA super formula. Basically, this uses the power of computing to and artificial intelligence to better predict the IOL power. So basically, we've known about AI for a very long time, but it's only recently that we have really been able to apply it because the computing power has become so much better. And essentially what we are using is something called neural networks and radial basis function. So this has been there since 1997, but because of rudimentary computing power, we could really harness its power. And now, after 2016, this has really been kind of come into vogue in a big way. And it has multiple applications in medicine, etc. So you can see all these images. We know who these people are just by looking at the outline, even though you can't see their face, right? So just like that, if you have a data set which is available and you train the computer to identify that with this data set, this should be the ideal IOL power based on historical evidence, you can essentially get a very accurate IOL power calculation. And these applications in facial recognition, which we use in our modern day phones, fingerprint recognition technology, ECG recognition, etc. All these places, this is being used. So again, this is available online on these websites. The LADA super formula is available on iolcalc.com. And essentially, earlier that distinction that short eyes, long eyes, you have different formulas. Most of these newer formulas work very well for almost all axial lengths. Another new formula that has come into vogue recently is the Kane formula, which uses traditional theoretical optics along with big data techniques. So it's a combination of different techniques to give you very, very accurate results as good as Universal 2 and Hill RBF. The second important thing that has happened is the improvements in our biometry. Traditional biometry was ultrasound and keratometry, but now we have these optical biometers which evolved through partial coherence interferometry and optical coherence, low coherence reflectometry. And now the gold standard has become the swept source OCT, which gives you fabulous results, and it can go through dense cataracts, which the older optical biometers could not do. I think I've run out of time, so I won't go into these specific situations, but essentially, just for post-refractive surgery, I think this one website is very useful, iolcalc.org. This is very useful for post-LASIK, post-PRK, and post-RKIs. And, this one website has really helped solve a lot of our problems with respect to post-refractive eyes, which are a challenge in our post-refractive cases when you're doing cataract surgery. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rishi. If you can stop sharing your screen before, while Parul can share a screen if she wants. But just a couple of questions. You feel that you would take look at Barrett TK, TrueK, or you would look at Haigis-L, because I somehow, after the Barretts have come in, it's sort of one go-to for all kinds of situations. And I think for the general audience, if you do not have optical biometers too, you can take your measurements even in an immersion keratometry or any other keratometry and feed it into the online ways of ASCRS.com, APACRS, and you get very good results, which actually has started encouraging us to even do multifocals for post-LASIK eyes. Of course, we have to counsel differently for them, but what do you say about that, Rishi?
So yes, these can be applied to traditional biometry techniques also, ma'am.
So I saw you have shown Haigis-L as your priority. I was wondering.
No. I use a combination of those. Basically, now I use the online calculator, which gives us all the readings.
Yes.
And essentially, I'll see if everything is matching. If there is something which is an outlier, then I look at it more carefully. And of course, I give more weightage to the Barrett TrueK, which is really outshined everything else.
Yes. And as far as RK is concerned, how would you think to differ or want to differ, or you would follow the same?
Again, I go with the online calculator. The only difference in post RK eyes, I'll always choose the most myopic power suggested among all the powers instead of the average, which I would do in the post LASIK eyes, I will choose the most myopic because I would much rather end up with a myopic refractive surprise than hyperopic. But otherwise, it has made our life very easy. We don't need to apply our brains. You just need to input the data and it comes out. But having said that, post-RK eyes are a challenge. You can still end up with surprises. So it may not be unreasonable to even go a little further and aim a little more myopic than what you're getting with all the formulas. You'd rather end up with a myopia. The second option is to intraoperatively just do a retinoscopy, just to reconfirm where you are at and then implant the lens. And I used to do that earlier, but now I think I've been getting fairly good results with the machines that I have. Especially OCT has come in very handy because it gives you true net corneal power, which in post-RK eyes I find very useful.
Yeah, because we need to get as close to the center when you're making your measurements in post-RK, because other areas are quite distorted.
Yes, central.
So that itself, because of that, you need to add that little myopia in your end result, because you're actually underestimating your how flat the clay is. And the other point is there is some amount of hyperopic shift also which occurs in these eyes in the post-operative period. So being a little myopic makes is a greater advantage. So I don't know about the time issues. So instead of discussing more, unless there's some other question by the other panelists, shall we go on to our next speaker? Yes. Yes, Parul, on to you.
Yeah. Am I audible?
Yes, you're audible. You have to see your slides.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to do. Okay, so we've heard enough from Dr. Gaurav and Dr. Priya as to why all the cataract surgeons should now move on to the refractive. And I would just put it in one line saying everybody's dil mange more. So the patient wants more, the surgeon wants to improve his skills. So here we are in this session discussing why we should become refractive from just a cataract surgery. So, when the starters, when you're starting, there's so many things which you heard about presbyopic lenses and other stuff, issue with contrast sensitivity, glare, halos, that could be a problem in the vision. You're asking your patients to more, and even the established surgeons hear this once in a while, doctor, maza nahi aaya. So how do we start right? So for people who are starting and going on to presbyopic correcting IOLs, know your choices. First, read about them, talk to your colleagues. So these are the options that you have, and we'll just go one by one as to how to choose the correct lenses for your patient. First and foremost important thing is when you're starting out, select, everybody's spoken about, patient selection. I would say look for patients who are selfly motivated. They come to your OPD and they have looked at these options. Maybe you have brochures outside, posters talking about refractive options, and they ask you. So these are good patients to select. Realistic expectations, you don't want too much hassles later on, so fine. To all said and done, diffractive IOLs do have in certain patients, night glares and halos problems. So I would avoid them. Clinically, very important. Just broadly, when you start looking at the patient at the slit lamp, make sure that you're looking at the lids. There should be no meibomitis, no ocular surface. Do your Schirmers, do your T-puts, make sure that the tear film is okay, because that could make your 6x6 a very unhappy 6x6 post multifocal lenses. Look at the topo, rule out very high order aberrations. Make sure that the retina is normal. So you may not charge the patient of a macula, but make sure that he's sitting on an OCT you run through so that you detect any early epiretinal membranes or early trucents, right? Look at the astigmatism, because then we will plan accordingly. Okay. Now, which is your best patient to pick up when you start? Look at a hyperopic patient. He's going to be very grateful to you. Pick up low astigmatism to begin with, no astigmatism preferably, because once you've mastered the art of presbyopic, then we'll tell you how to go on to choosing multifocal and astigmatism. Bilateral preferably, because they are much happier that way. It's all about the summation at the brain level. And as I said, make sure that there is no other ocular pathology. We wanted you to know as an audience, people, the starters, that you don't need fancy equipments. Whatever you have in your clinical practice, As everybody has pointed out earlier, Dr. Chitra and Dr. Gaurav, use immersion ASTM. You're not doing corneal compression that way. So you are very sure of your axial length. When you look at Kerato, I'm sure you have a manual one, you have an auto, you have a topo. So try and look at all the readings so that they match. I normally tell them, look at the multiple readings. I go for the power on manual, auto, if, at one of the centers, I don't have fancy equipments. And I look at my axis on the topo one. Pick up your data pre and post, give it to a company person so that he can calculate your surgical induced astigmatism. It will help you a lot in personalizing your A constant. As pointed out earlier by the speakers, this is a boon. You don't need fancy optical biometers. All what you have to do is with your readings together, which you're very sure of now, go on to these sites and there you have your precise IOL power to choose from. Now, this whole gamut of which lenses to choose from. Talk to your patient, understand the visual needs. Is he just into reading? There is no intermediate work, or he's not into reading at all and prefers big screens when they are doing work. So those kind of his day-to-day routine. Understand their comfort level of paying. There's no point pushing a low-paying person premium lenses, and if he's not happy, later on it's going to pinch him a lot. So these are small practical tips which you should keep in your mind in OPD. Talk to your colleagues. Don't start with just, Indian, I don't want to say Indian companies are bad, but something which has not been tried and tested. You don't want to burn your fingers initially. Talk to your colleagues who've been using lenses and then go accordingly. I want to sensitize you to how important the intermediate vision has now become just in the reading. So you've seen the evolution of presbyopic lenses from where we started from a +4 reading correction, because it was all about reading. And now we know that intermediate correction at 6 to 80 centimeter is much more important. So this is the whole gamut of lenses options for you in trifocals, extended depth of vision. Now we have extended range of vision lenses. So this slide is just to give you an overview that there are that many lenses out there. Broadly, what your diffractive lenses are doing is basically making different multiple foci so that you get an extended range of vision. And there are many, many modifications which keep coming on how to choose the rings, how their size, their width, so that, the problems of light utilization, the problem of contrast, glare hairs becomes less and less. So I won't go into the real optics of it because I want you to get an overview on how to, incorporate more and more presbyopic lenses in your practice. Optics we can discuss later, but on a comparative basis, like if you look at various lenses, you will know that which lens is offering you what kind of correction. For example, one company will say that, okay, I'm smoothing out my steps so that there is no glare and halogens from the edge. So if the person is night driving, I would probably choose this lens which is offering me less night and glare. Now, when you're operating, no major fancy changes in your phacosurgery. I'm sure you're a temporal surgeon by now because that's astigmatic neutral. Make sure that your CC is good because we want an overlapping coverage on your IOL so that it's centered properly. Make sure that you aspirate your visco from behind the lens so that there is no decentration once you're out. Similar reason, proper wound hydration. And on how to check the centration of your lens. Normally what I do is at the end of the surgery, I ask the patient to look directly into the microscope light and I try to get the Purkinje's image into the center of the optic, though ultimately it doesn't matter. It takes up the size of the capsule only, but still it gives you a good feeling if you've centered your lens well. So out of the big bracket of trifocal versus EDOF, I would say that, for me, I feel trifocals give you a very good range because EDF, all said and done, the near vision, like if your patient is a close reader, does get a bit compromised and you have to do these tweaks of one eye dominant distance and then the other eye you keep a little myopic kind of a micro monovision, which trifocals you don't have to bother about. And if once you've mastered your presbyopia, then you incorporate your astigmatism into correcting presbyopia. So you can start picking up patients with astigmatism. If it is less than 0.75, you can do an LRI or you can place your incision on the steep axis. If it's higher than that, then you have the option of, things like trifocal and EDO, the plate haptics, toric to begin with that. And as I said, use multiple instruments to get your power and axis correct. So you have enough to pick and choose from, but let's not forget there may be a situation where your patient is not paying in the paying capacity. You don't want to take a chance, but you still want to give him a decent range. The good old monovision is good, where you keep you should know how to know the dominant eye distance, and depending on his reading or intermediate need. One thing which I think which everybody can adapt is the enhanced monofocal, because it gives you the distance and a bit of intermediate also. So apart from all the presbyopic, I just wanted to highlight these two lenses also, which are giving you more range than just correcting the distance ones. So major thing in your refractive practice is, do not say the word get rid of glasses. As long as you're saying that you decrease the spectacle dependence, you will be very good. And just starting good is a job well done. So thank you, and we can have a discussion after this.
Yes. So we have how many more speakers left? I am there, and
I'm there, ma'am.
you're there. Okay. So we are on till 1:55. Okay. So Rishi, you have any question at this point of time for presbyo correcting IOLs? I sort of believe that Indian IOLs do have multifocals are doing well now. I think one of my reasonings to that is, we are now getting to address target emmetropia to a larger extent with the better way of using the biometers and optimizing our IOL power constants. So often the dissatisfaction for these patients are because of the little residual refractive error which would creep in, which we would want to overlook. So now I think besides the IOL designs and the greater evolved understanding, Indian IOLs do seem to have a place in our market too. Your thoughts, Parul, on that?
So I haven't used too many of them because my clientele is a bit premium, and but I do take a feedback from a lot of my colleagues, and yes, as you're rightly saying, they're quite happy with them. I think IOCare, Biotech, these are companies which are doing quite well. So yes,
Doing well. And what is your tolerance for astigmatism? Like from when would you plan to do arcuates, or when would you start doing?
So I think my cutoff is 1, and I'm always perplexed when I see these 0.75. I don't like them because I don't know where to put them. And LRI, you can never be very sure of. I can put them on my femto, but I really don't know if it's going to stay like that for after 6 months. So above 1, I'm very comfortable. Panoptix Toric has given very good result. Lately, I've started Zeiss AT-LISA Toric also, but I've avoided them in big bags because I'm not sure how stable they are. But these 2 lenses, Toric, I've used, and they're pretty good.
Yeah. So more for the.
I have one question, if I may.
Yeah. Yes.
So lately we have these different optics lenses which are available in the Indian market. You have the Lucidis, you have Minivel, and you have the Lentis. So what are your thoughts on these lenses? Because I've tried a few and actually they're not bad. Some patients are pretty happy. So anybody here has experience with these lenses? It would be nice to know.
I don't have, but I have tried the Care Group multifocals, and
Care Group are pretty good. Yeah.
Pretty good. So
what about the trifocal? What about the Care Group trifocal and the Biotech trifocal?
I have not had a very good experience with the Care Group one. Some patients were happy, some were not.
We are very happy with the multifocal, but trifocal, I don't have a clear cut. And trifocal, I've normally gone in for the other lenses, but I'm sure, Gaurav, you might have something to tell on that.
On what, ma'am? I just joined, so
no. We were talking about Indian multifocals and trifocals.
Right. So Indian multifocals have come of age, I think, and I'm really happy with many of them. And for patients who can't afford, we now have a clear segment for those patients who can't afford to buy, to put in the expensive ones, and they're quite happy with that, frankly. But what's competing with them now is the Eyehance kind of lens, where I end up sometimes, putting an Eyehance kind of lens where patient is not, sure what he wants, and wants only good intermediate. But if somebody wants good reading, you have to put in an Indian multifocal if you can afford one.
Parul, I even put in lot of do femtocataracts and put an Acridif multifocal and make them feel happy. They feel they have saved money on that kind of segment. So, it expands your opening more LRCS patients with a budget.
I've had a couple of patients who had the Indian multifocal first, and then second eye, they wanted a better lens and took the international one, and they still prefer the Indian one. So, Yeah.
The only thing while we're talking on IHANS, I have figured out that for me at least, and I want to know from the panel, is that IHANS in presence of astigmatism, anything more than 0.5 or 0.75 is not giving that accurate intermediate distance. So now I've restricted IHANS to only purely, either no astigmatism or 0.5.
One prerequisite with IHANS is you have to be spot on near emmetropia, not even 0.5.
Yeah, they're not tolerant to astigmatism at all. Then the effect, intermediate effect, goes off completely.
I think I would use IHANS as just as a very good quality. If they get some intermediate vision, they get it. I don't promise them anything on that.
How many talks left, ma'am?
My talk is there and Rohan's talk is there.
So let's go ahead and then we'll have more time for discussion. Should we ask Rohan to quickly?
Go on.
You've kept time well, ma'am. Thank you.
No, your speakers were damn good. Gave all the stuff in the short time.
That's why I pick all the best speakers.
So good afternoon, everyone. It's a hot Sunday afternoon, perfect to stay indoors and learn. The talk, all these talks before, they've been extremely informative, and I hope I can do justice to this topic. So I'm going to be speaking on managing refractive surprise after cataract surgery. I would like to I will take this opportunity to thank Dr. Gaurav, who has been my mentor and has played a pivotal role in my professional learning. Thank you so much for the opportunity, sir. So what exactly is a refractive surprise? A refractive surprise is the failure to achieve the intended postoperative refractive target. It can cause anisometropia or dominant switch as well, as it is a source of patient dissatisfaction due to the unmet expectations. But the times have changed now. With the evolution of precise technology, what we used to consider refractive surprise years back, now the definition has completely changed. Now, even a residual refraction of more than 0.5 squares or an astigmatism of more than 0.75 diopters may be considered a refractive surprise, whereas 10 years ago, maybe this was not. So now what next? An unknown error has occurred. So what is it that we're going to do next? We need to don the detective hat and we need to look for clues because it's a big part of management lies in finding where the error is. We need to make sure that we plan for the unplanned. So the sources of error can lie either in your planning, your measurement, or your execution. So errors in planning, if you're not implanted the correct lens into the correct patient, that sometimes happens in a busy OT. Haven't used the correct IOL formula. In special eyes, you tend to go wrong when there are long and short eyes. Dr. Rishi covered that very well, which formula to use to get bang on results. Error in data insertion and a previous refractive surgery. Again, this is a tricky topic, and previous refractive surgery patients, we tend to get the calculations wrong, despite all the ASCRS calculators that have come in and given us, great results. Errors in measurement. Errors is possible in contact biometry due to the excess indentation of the cornea. Compression of 0.5 millimeter can have an error of 1.25 diopters. Off-axis measurement, if the probe is not perpendicular, it can cause an error. A 0.5 millimeter of axis can have an error of a plus 1.25 diopters. Always measure both eyes, and if the difference between the two eyes is more than 0.3 millimeters, then you have to repeat the measurement. And it's not just in contact biometry. You can also have errors in your optical biometry or your optical topography reading that you're taking. So what can go wrong here is just the position of the chin. So this is an example that we took. So the eye is, the chin is placed in one position. Now, if there is a head tilt, it can, we see in these readings, it causes a 1 diopter in magnitude difference and a 10 degree in axis, which can make you go way off. Next is, of course, errors in execution. Retained lens there, then that can cause a refractive surprise, a retained OVD, a decentered IOL, all these things. There's another thing important is a capsular back distension. This may be seen in a few cases, and what this does is that there is a fluid accumulation behind. You need to yard these patients as soon as you detect them. So once you have detected where the error lies, you need to don the hat of Dr. Fix and make sure that you deliver on patient satisfaction. So where do we begin? first step is your counseling. So whatever you have promised the patient preoperatively, as we have heard in this talk, do not ever say to the patient that I'm going to make you spectacle independent. So you talk to the patient, you talk about the profession of the patient, you see what the needs of the patients are, and never ever say that you're guilty. I mean, you of course need to inform the patient that a refractive surprise has occurred, but you should not be admitting to any guilt that this thing has gone wrong, and because you can easily fix it. So next, how do you make a decision? So making a decision depends upon when do you actually detect that refractive error has occurred. Do you detect it on post-operative day 1, 14, or maybe even 2 months after surgery? Also, it depends upon whether it is your patient or the patient has come from elsewhere. So a POD1, you would, of course, again, first go back to the drawing board and counsel the patient. And most importantly, you would see that if the patient has been wearing spectacles since a long time, maybe patient is all right wearing spectacles. The next debate is a myopic shift versus a hyperopic shift. So here, the thing is that if it's a hyperopic shift, it needs immediate attention. Whereas if it's a myopic shift, we can always look at the contralateral eye. If it's a cataractous eye, then we can plan the surgery for the next eye and give monovision to the patient, and the patient can be happy. So the options for management include glasses, contact lens, piggyback IOLs, laser refractive surgery, LASIK or surface, and IOL exchange. So if patient is all right with glasses and contact lenses, this generally happens in patients who've been wearing it since a long time, then they can be counseled for that. A piggyback IOL, we know that we can place it in front of the IOL. Most importantly, there is this Gill's nomogram that needs to be followed to calculate what is the power that you need to use. So an underpowered pseudophakic that is in hyperopes, the power, if it's less than the axial length is less than 21, it's going to be 1.5 into spherical equivalent plus 1. In average eyes, it's going to be 1.4 into spherical equivalent plus 1. And in long eyes, it should be 1.3 into spherical equivalent plus 1. Whereas in overpowered eyes and myopes, it's going to be 1.5 into spherical equivalent minus 1. Whereas in average eyes, it will be 1.4 into spherical equivalent minus 1. So in myopes, you would subtract 1, whereas in hyperopes, you would add 1. Next comes the decision tree. The decision tree post-operative refractive error, you need to see if it's inside your personal LASIK limits. Example, less than 6 diopters or a myopia less than 5 diopters, astigmatism or myopia less than 3 diopters. If it's outside your limit, then you'll have to go for an IOL exchange if the patient has come to you, within 2 weeks of surgery, or then a supplementary IOL. Subsequent slides, I'll be talking about what are the pros and cons for these. So laser procedures, advantages, it avoids additional intraocular surgical procedure, better accuracy, especially for the correction of residual cylinders. A recent study using LASIK to correct residual refraction error after cataract found 92.85% eyes achieved the final spherical equivalent within plus minus 0.5 diopters and 100% eyes within plus minus 1 diopter. LASIK is easier in eyes with previous YAG capsulotomy done, whereas the lens exchange, if we do it, it's risky and difficult. So how long do you wait? PRK can be, of course, done at any time. LASIK, when the incision is stable, and nobody knows actually for sure when you can do that, but generally we tend to wait for at least a month. Marked derivation in IOP from microkeratomy can be caused. So mostly PRK procedure is preferred. And if unacceptable to the patient, then you do a PRK. Now in IOL exchange, you have to remove the foldable lens. It can be removed after cutting or unfolding it through a 2.8 to 3 millimeter incision. It is preferable to do an IOL exchange early within 2 weeks, as I said, before the capsular bag has fibrosed. The drawbacks of doing an IOL exchange is you can cause a capsular rupture, a vitreous loss, zonular dialysis, retinal tears, or a macular edema. So this next slide basically sums up how you need to deal with a refractive surprise. So if the refractive error is a hyperopia up to 1 diopter, then an optic capture can suffice. A hyperopia from 1 to 3 diopters or a myopia up to 8 diopters and astigmatism up to 5, within 1 month needs an IOL exchange, and more than 3 months a laser refractive surgery. Then a hyperopia greater than 3 diopters, again within a month IOL exchange, and more than 3 months a secondary piggyback implant. Now looking at rotation.
You'll have to conclude.
Yes,
I'm so sorry. I have to interrupt. I'm extremely sorry for this, but we have a very limited time, so we have to sum it up by 1:45. Because we have.
Yeah, I'm just finished, ma'am. I'll just
Yeah,
finish.
thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. So when we do, how do we fix it? There is a rotation. First of all, you don't go ahead and fix it immediately. You fix it after a week. The online calculator, astigmatismfix.com is there. You enter these data into the online calculator and actually gives you at the right corner here that how much do you need to rotate the toric IOL. If you rotate the toric IOL, you will be able to achieve the intended diffraction that is there. So important take-home messages: LASIK is the most accurate procedure to correct residual refractive error after cataract surgery. Lens-based procedures such as IOL exchange or piggyback lens implantation are also possible alternatives in cases with extreme ametropia, corneal abnormalities, or in situations where excimer laser is not available, and piggyback IOL is a safer and more accurate method than IOL exchange. Thank you.
Thanks, Rohan. I'll request Dr. Chitra to immediately start.
Yes, I'll share my screen and
It's a
start.
very
off, and
important presentation.
if time allows, then we could discuss beyond that.
Yes.
So my due is to talk on clear lens exchange, and the purpose here is not to treat a pathology or a cataract, but rather to enhance the performance. So why we stand at a level where we can confidently contemplate clear lens exchange is because of the improvement in the surgical skill sets, our greater understanding about biometry, IOL power calculation, and our constant drive to enhance ourselves. So basically, there are two ways when you place points where you think of doing a refractive lens exchange, either for a low ametrope and a presbyo. In that kind of a situation, you could choose your lens and do a target refraction and explain about the surgical and the post-op risk. Or the other section is if it is a high refractive error, which cannot be corrected by laser vision correction or an ICL, you need to explain to both the groups that there is going to be a loss of accommodation, which is a huge loss. But having said that, when they are very much driven about it, you need to still explain that because of the extremes of architecture in these high refractive errors, there are certain post-operative challenges, surgical challenges, but you are in a position to do the best for them. So I'm just going to run you through case examples. Like this is a patient with just a small hyperopic refractive error and went ahead and we advised laser vision correction. Went ahead to do a clear lens exchange. Now, before that, you do an eye trace. Now, how eye trace helps us is you are able to identify this dysfunctional lens index, whereas below 5 down, there is a definite lens change. Between 5 and 7 up, there is a segment where the presbyopia is causing some changes in the dysfunctional lens index or early lens changes have come. Essentially, you see there's a point spread is different. There is a lack of contrast. There is some amount of glare. And when you put them on these eye trays, you get to realize that there is a reason for these patients to be disturbed with these with this kind of quality of vision, and they would be quite acceptable and familiar to a thought of going in for a clear lens exchange. Now, if you look at this particular patient, this was a patient who underwent LRCS with toric IOL with an astigmatic keratotomy because the amount of astigmatism was quite small. Running you through the surgery, the advantage of doing it on a laser cataract platform is you have a free floating rhexis. The rhexis has to be picked up. You literally, like, these segments are all separated. You have to just inject viscoelastic and don't even have to chop them, and they're all lying there to be just picked up. So there is absolutely hardly any surgical manipulation. And if you have a more advanced phacoemulsification machines, the anterior chamber is so stable, your posterior segment is hardly put into stress by operating on these younger patients. And then it's all about a nice round rhexis, an ideal IOL wrap, and you place your lenses. And if it's a toric, you position it in the axis. If it's not a toric, you definitely ensure you thoroughly clean up the eye of all the viscoelastic and position it. Ensure that the first Purkinje reflex and the fourth are in alignment. It's well centered, and then your end result is going to be as optimal as you can imagine. So this is how this patient did well and was extremely gratified with the end results. The point to note when it is short eyes, your IOL power is going to be very significant. It's going to be a large part IOL. And in short eyes, because of the anatomical variations in these eyes, it could be an eye with a normal anterior chamber or a short and shallow anterior chamber. And we may always be challenged in predicting the effective lens position. So, and again, because it's a very large part IOL, you have to be careful. You might end up with a large refractive surprise. So then You need to counsel your patient. You could go in for a customized IUL, but when you go in for a very high powered IULs, you should be wary that there could be spherical aberrations which are induced. So you could place a bulk of the power in the bag, and the remaining you could do it as a piggy bag. These are the ways which you need to look at. Now, this is case 2, which was a high myope, an inadequate anterior chamber, too high apart, and could not be, and the posterior float was asleep. So laser vision correction was out, and the patient was very keen on doing a pre-lex. Now, I wouldn't normally advise a 35-year-old for a clear lens extraction, but in these kind of situations, if you need a posterior segment evaluation, and if there is a PVD is there and the posterior, there are no treatable retinal lesions, everything is fine, then you, and if look for a staphyloma if it is there, because you need to be very particular that you use your optical biometers to get the right kind of an axial length measurement. You should do a B scan, which will further inform you that yes, there's PVD, or whether the presence of posterior staphyloma is not there or not. And then when it comes to the IUL power calculation, you need to go for the best. When you want to do a clear lens exchange, go for an optimal biometer, choose either between a Barrett Universal 2 or an Hill RBF or a Vancock modification of axial length, taking you through the surgery. Because these eyes are large eyes, you might to make a smaller axis. You can't again make it too bigger axis, because then you would end up with an optic capture. And then the other important thing is you should be very careful about the AC shallowing. There could be, what can happen is a reverse pupillary block where the iris can go and get stuck on the lens. So the stability very optimal. You should be very careful that you keep injecting viscoelastic when you get your machine in and out. You need to be also conscious that too much of AC fluctuation is not going to be good for the posterior segment, because there's already vitreal syneresis is there. So all this, and also we need to remember when you hold your instruments, you're going to be using them vertically down, and it's not most optimally comfortable, but you need to do an ideal cataract surgery and a good cortical cleanup. And these are best done if you could on a laser cataract platform, where much of what I said becomes actually a child's play, and it's all done very conscious about a complete viscoelastic removal. And you should avoid anterior lens capsule polishing if it is a toric. So finally, the pearls which have to be considered is you need to examine them with great accuracy, right from the ocular surface to the pupil, to all the details right up to the retina. You need to use a non-contact optical measurement. You should verify the quality of your raw data. If there is a dry eye, treat them, validate your measurements. Do not remove yourself from the process. Choose the right IOL. Please definitely treat the smallest astigmatism. You have a beautiful range of IOLs. Understand your patient, what they want. You have a low ad. You have a +4 if they want to do a lot of reading work. You have the extended depth of IOLs. You have the trifocals there. So the key to success in a clear lens extraction, choose the right patient, the kind which Parul discussed, a patient who's very motivated, choose the right kind of IOL, the right formulae, and the perfect surgery. There's absolutely no compromise on that. If you're going to contemplate a clear lens extraction, I would not say that you jump into doing it, but you have to be so damn sure about all 3 parameters to conclude to say that you are going to do a clear lens exchange. Thank you.
Good afternoon, doctor. This is from scientific team. Doctor, there is a keynote address we are going to play it now of Dr. Gerd Offer.
Okay.
Ramesh, please play it first.
Hello. எனக்கு அடுத்தது உடனே ஆரம்பிக்கிறது நான் இங்க ஸ்டார்ட் பண்ணேன். சரியா ஒரு ஆரம்பிக்கிறது.
Is it a pre-recorded one?
Hello, everybody. This is Gerd Auffert from Heidelberg. And it's a pleasure for me to deliver this keynote lecture here. My topic that I've chosen is about challenges in cataract surgery. It's a pleasure to talk to my Indian colleagues here. These are my financial disclosures, which are not really related to the topic. I would like to address a couple of topics here in complicated anterior segment surgery, small pupil, iris defects, dislocated bags, secondary IOL implantation, and also cataract surgery in other challenging situations, even complex trauma. And I think we can get through this lecture in a decent time. People with posterior synechia, with iritis or other circumstances are not so rare, and they come to the clinic and you have to find a way to do it. There are a lot of surgical tools that you can use to dilate the pupil if it's kind of challenging. You can do just the simple pupil stretching. You can use iris retractors, Huygens ring is very famous. The other devices like the RCA pupil expander, and there are a lot of Indian developments also in this context, and the iRing, which I also like to use quite often. If we look at a case example here, for example, a uveitis patient, you can see here the synechia, pupil is not dilating. Normally what you sometimes do is give some suprarenin or something like this to dilate the pupil, and if you see it is really there, the synechia, then you try to loosen it first. Sometimes I take a spatula, sometimes I take a viscoelastic cannula like here and try to open it. You usually see that there is a kind of pupillary membrane which can be drawn apart, the pupillary rim, quite easy, here with these kind of forceps, for example, without damaging, as a matter of fact, the pupillary margin. And you can see you can take it off here carefully, but it goes out. And sometimes you can actually dilate the pupil under the circumstances with viscometriasis or something, or you have to use a device like this. This is called an iRing, and it's consisted of 4 little areas where you hang the iris in. You have some instruments for this, either spatula or some little hooks to do that. And here the iris rim is really spanned out here on this thing. It gives you like a 6 millimeter opening, which is very protective for the pupillary rim. After we have put that in here, we just go ahead with the phaco, put in the intraocular lens like this. And what you usually do is, before you remove the whole viscoelastic, you can actually withdraw the iRing here. So I place the lens inside. And then the same way you got the ring in, you get it out with this little applicator. You can more or less take it out without opening the incision or something like this. Just draw it back in the injector and take it out. Usually the pupil looks quite nice and round, and you don't have any problems like you have sometimes with iris retractors, where you see the defect. Let's go to another interesting case here. We have a patient who had several keratoplasty in his eye. He actually had a severe Huygens syndrome, ulcera, and other problems. He also had some other challenges, medical challenges. And you see here the situation where in both eyes you have a cataract, and the iris, due to several surgeries, also was damaged. You can see here huge areas where the iris is defect. So there's not a real iris anymore, just parts of it. Visual acuity is very bad, as you can see here. And here we think about the surgical planning, especially the pre-surgical planning. We have, as you have also in India, a lot of choices in terms of patients with aniridia or iris defects. You have special capsular tension rings with segments here, or even aniridia lenses here by a company called Morcha, or artificial iris. In this case, I chose actually this device here. It's a Morcha type 50F capsular ring with segments here like this. I will show you the surgery here. The surgery itself was, of course, important in terms of preserving the cornea. I put the iris here with some iris retractors. Did the phaco. The phaco wasn't really so challenging, and when you remove here the remnants of the cortex, you could see it's pretty stable actually. So it gives you already a feeling, what can I do afterwards? Can I put in this device or not? After I cleaned the capsular bag, I inserted the device, and you have to actually extend the incision here by almost to 3.5 to 4 diopters. And having a lot of these segments, it's kind of fiddling around to get it through the small incision without hanging in here with between the segments. But after a while, one after the other went inside the capsular bag. And the idea here is to put first this thing in and then later the intraocular lens, because the lens must be behind this in the capsular bag. So with forceps and spatula. We dialed in each individual segment. Of course, you also have to be careful not to damage the small type of iris which is left. Then after a while, everything went in. And in this situation, I thought, well, if I get the ring in, everything is easy afterwards. And I was thinking, what kind of lens would I put in? Would I put in a hydrophilic lens, which unfolds very fast, but which is very soft and forgiving? Or shall I use a hydrophobic lens, which opens up very slowly, so more controlled? I decided actually for a hydrophobic intraocular lens, as you will see in a second. So now the whole thing is in the capsular bag. We put in some more viscoelastic to deepen the capsular bag. And then the lens is to be inserted here. Which we can see right now. Yeah, viscoelastic. Now the lens is in, the first haptic also is in the bag. But here we had the problem that the second haptic was kind of sticking in a bad way onto the optic, and when we want to put the lens in, it got stuck between two of these segments. So it took me quite a bit of time actually to place it under the segment, then inside the capsular bag. Eventually it went well, as you can see here. And now we have the situation that the peripheral iris is more or less fully covered and also stabilized in this situation. And we almost have like a pinhole effect here with this artificial iris ring. And the first day already, the patient had uncorrected visual acuity of 0.63 decimal, and after a year I saw him lately 0.8. So very nice visual acuity outcome, zero glare and halo, which was quite nice for this patient, and he was very happy about this, and this segment was a good solution here. Here we were lucky that the capsular bag was pretty stable. What happens if this whole capsular bag and the whole segment with the capsular bag and the IOL is decentric? For example, in pseudoexfoliation eyes. We have quite a bit of those where we put actually in capsular tension ring and everything. And then after 5 or 10 years, the whole thing was just hanging on the, or lying on the anterior part of the vitreous, if there was vitreous. So we have a case like this here. And again, here also you have to do some planning and put some thoughts to it. So what I usually do in this case is, before I start even, I put a trocar, so I have some more opportunities from pars plana. In this case here, I support the movement that you see here, where we dial the whole segment in the anterior chamber, like this. And now it's fairly easy actually to take the lens out with the Sommerings ring and everything. I think in this case it was actually a PMA lens, so it's a longer time ago. We opened this up to like 7 millimeters, something like this. It didn't really fit through directly, so what I had to do is take a stronger forceps, like a so-called Doden forceps I use for this, which is very stable to grab the whole thing, and then you have a good way to take it out. Then we do via pars plana the cleaning of the capsular bag here, not of the capsular bag, of the anterior vitreous, so that this one is completely free of it. And then we have to think about secondary IOL implantation, and what we do quite often in Germany. I don't think it's so common in India, but we like actually to put a retropupillary fixation of an artisan lens. You see here the artisan lens, which is turned upside down, and it's placed at the beginning onto the iris, as you can see here, but it's not fixated like this. You will just see that we take now a forceps and move the whole thing.
Every technician, we have to play fast or have to stop.
Take it here and put it behind the iris, like this. You lift it up, and this goes fair.
Thank you, doctors, for your all presentations. Thank you so much for joining us.
Here we grab it now. Could
Okay, stop.
Yes, Ramesh.
Yeah, you can stop sharing the screen. Yeah.
Thanks, everybody. And I think our time has run out. Next session, I think Rohit is already here. I can see Rohit. Thank you so much, everyone, for being part of the course. And
Thank you, Gaurav. It was a very good course.
I really enjoyed the course. I would say I enjoyed it as one of the best so far.
Oh, great. Thank you so much, ma'am. Thanks. Hi, Chaitra.
Thank you, Gaurav. Thanks, everybody. Rishi,
Thank you.
Chitra,
Bye.
ma'am.
Nice
as usual,
seeing
lovely
all of you,
talk. Bye,
Parul.
Priya.
Nice seeing you, Priya, Rishi.